One other scientist that contributed to Darwin's ideas of natural selection is Malthus. He saw that there were more babies born than there were deaths. That there were consequences for overproducing within an environment, whether it be with humans and limits on human population, war, famine, different types of diseases. And ultimately, there is a struggle for existence. So when you have, let's say, several eggs that are being laid, thousands or hundreds of seeds that are being dispersed, there's only a certain percentage that are going to survive. And that, given a certain environment, there's always going to be a struggle for survival. Here we are, finally, Charles Darwin. So he was an English naturalist, and in 1831 he joined the HMS Beagle for a 5-year research voyage around the world. Basically what they were trying to figure out is chart the South American coastline. So I'll show you a map in just a moment of the path of the HMS Beagle. Along the way, because Darwin was a naturalist studying the surroundings and environment and living things, he collected and studied plants and animal specimens both. He picked up bones and fossils, and one of the most notable stops that they made was the Galapagos Islands and a tropical set of volcanic islands, and he noted that there was such diversity in life in these islands that varied from island to island. He also noted along the way that certain environments had similar organisms that you wouldn't necessarily think. So, for example, in temperate South America, temperate being like mild temperatures, in South America where there were mild temperatures, those organisms that lived there were best compared to organisms that lived in Europe in temperate environments as well. Whereas more tropical South America, there was a big difference. So it's really odd that when you have South America versus South America, tropic South America versus temperate South America, it's still the same continent. Why aren't those organisms similar to one another? Whereas Europe, way far away, but the environment is the same, there seem to be similar organisms there. So here is the path leaving from Europe, the HMS Beagle, moving south down all along the South American border, and then moving up the South American border, going to Australia, through different sets of islands into the tip of Africa, and then back briefly to South America, up to Europe. One of the prime examples of natural selection and descent with modification is the finch. The birds were all about the same size that lived on different islands of the Galapagos, but the shape and the size of their beaks of each of them were different based on the availability of different or specific types of food on their home island. So if you look at the picture, you can see all of these birds are finches, but their beaks are very different. So we have a cactus eater, an insect eater, and a seed eater. So the idea of natural selection is that individuals with certain traits tend to survive and reproduce at higher rates because of that trait that they have. And it has to be best suited for the environment. So if we switch these birds and put the cactus eater on the island where there wasn't any cactus or cacti, most likely it wouldn't survive and wouldn't be able to reproduce. So Darwin used these birds to kind of reinforce the fact that, again, over time, that these changes can become evident based on kind of survival of the fittest. Darwin waited about 30 years before publishing his ideas on evolution. So we have to remember that this was in the 1800s, and nobody really said anything that potentially could be against the Bible, could be against the idea that God created everything in a perfect way for a certain purpose on earth and that things don't change over time. So he was really hesitant and wanted to wait a long time before publishing his ideas. While he was waiting, there was another scientist, Alfred Russel Wallace, who actually went ahead and published a paper on natural selection first. While he was in the midst of publishing, he corresponded to Darwin, and Darwin read his works and kind of felt out of luck that Wallace beat him to it. But in their correspondences, and when Darwin sent Wallace his work, Wallace agreed that Darwin really nailed it on the head best because he had an overabundance of evidence to prove that individuals with characteristics, they tended to survive best for their environment, and that change accumulated over time, where then the organisms looked, they essentially became different species or looked very different. Charles Darwin's book is on the origin of species by the means of natural selection, often just called The Origin of Species. And again, this mechanism for evolution, the driving force behind change over time, is natural selection. And Darwin didn't actually use the term evolution, but again, he used descent with modification. So again, descent, from an ancestor moving forward, there are going to be organisms that are modified or have differences from their ancestors based on the ability to survive and reproduce for being best fit. So again, descent with modification, according to Darwin, is that organisms descended from an ancestor that lived in the remote past. So on the left, Darwin had a tree, basically. If you look very closely, you can see A, B, C, D. So those would represent his present-day organisms or species. And you can see that it branches back into the center. So tying together the species that he saw in a way that they were related to ancestors jointly. And then today we use something that we see on the right, and that's going to be called a cladogram. And it's another way to branch organisms and clump them together based on similarities, which we'll get more into that in chapter 20. I think at this point, I've already said this several times, what is natural selection? You can say it a few different ways, but adaptations that enhance an organism's ability to survive and reproduce in a specific environment. So there's tons and tons and tons of examples, but a desert fox having large ears versus an Arctic fox having small ears. Although we typically think of ears for hearing, in this case with the desert fox, at least, those really, really large ears are for releasing heat. So kind of like, we sweat, it cools our bodies down. The desert fox ears, they release heat, and that's one of the adaptations or inherited characteristics that those organisms have. If you look at the pictures down at the bottom, two other examples, you can see that if you look really closely, the flower on the left somewhat to me looks like an orchid, But there's an insect in there that has really good camouflage, and the same with the insect on the right, looking like a leaf. These would be two other adaptations, again, inherited characteristics that they have that make it more likely for them to survive and reproduce. And their children would have those characteristics as well. Something else that supported Darwin in his idea of natural selection is artificial selection. And although they're different, artificial selection still is evidence to support natural selection. So let's compare both of them, and then I'll summarize it in just a second. So natural selection is something that, again, nature or the environment decides. So an individual that is best suited for the environment has a higher likelihood that it's going to reproduce and pass on its genes or its trait, its adaptation. So again, the finch and those particular beaks being ideal for the environment, it happens naturally in an environment. Now, artificial selection is not natural. So man essentially usually decides, and it's based on selective breeding. So looking for a certain trait that's ideal. So whether it's something like animals or crops, seeing a particular trait and breeding for that trait. Now, often what tends to happen is inbreeding. And so this can happen with plants or with animals. So if you have a certain crop, using corn as an example, maybe you want to have the seeds be yellow and the seeds be large, you might do pollination with the same plant. So again, genetically, those plants are linked, and that would be, at least in the plant world, it would be considered inbreeding. The same thing happens a lot of the times with whether it be cats or dogs, and then Dalmatians as an example. When you see a certain trait, at least with breeders, animal breeders, they see a certain feature in that animal, and sometimes they will breed siblings together. Sometimes, again, like a female offspring with the dad in dog cases, cat cases, to increase the likelihood of a certain trait. So whether it's Dalmatian spots, we talked a couple years ago about polydactyly. So these are cats that have 5 digits on their hands. I know cats don't have hands, but on their front paws and on their back paws. So again, having a certain trait and breeding for that trait. So back to Darwin, comparing the two, if humans have the ability to create this short-term substantial change over time, then he believed that nature over a long period of time certainly can do the same thing. So although artificial selection is different than natural selection, it still is evidence to support that natural selection can take place on its own over a really long period of time. Some final key ideas or key points of natural selection: that there is competition for limited resources, and this will result in differential survival. So differential survival means that survival is not equal for everybody within that species or within that population. Differential survival is also known as survival of the fittest. Evolutionary fitness: individuals with more favorable adaptations are more likely to survive and produce more offspring, and they're going to pass those traits on to future generations, which again, through all these slides in 19.2, I feel like I've said that several different ways, and there are many different ways that you can explain natural selection and surviving and evolution. If environment changes or individuals move to a new environment, there will be new adaptations and new species may arise. And the last key idea that's really important, that populations evolve, not the individual. please go to the YouTube link. I know you can't click on it from here, but please jot it down and go to it. The video I think is about an hour and a half. That would be way too much time. So around 20 minutes to the 31-minute mark, please watch that.